What's going on, everybody? It's FREEDO and Weagle back again to discuss the big PTR patch that's coming through, changing a lot of heroes. Of course, the introduction of Hanzo Storm Arrow, a nerf to Tracer, a buff to Lucio, and a couple other little changes in there as well. The interesting thing to me that Blizzard keeps going down this route to, I like to say, always smash Genji in the face, trying to find more answers for players to destroy dive. And oddly enough, even though they keep doing that, the pros keep playing dive because the mobility is so required in the pro meta oftentimes. But I don't know how you guys feel about this, but for me, in matchmaking, a lot of these mobility characters, because you don't have the coordination of a pro team, is getting wrecked harder and harder and harder, especially with characters like Junkrat being really key, which makes it interesting that they're going the route to nerf a character like Tracer, who doesn't see anywhere near the amount of dominance in matchmaking as she does in the pro level of play. So we're going to discuss all these different characters, and I think that's where we're going to start off. Our appointed Tracer main, Weagle, what do you think about the Tracer changes?
Okay, so when this first came out, I was really surprised that Tracer had been changed. The 100 less damage to the bomb, though, I initially thought maybe it doesn't make a big difference, but she stays alive forever. Now, one thing that me and FREEDO just did some research on was, does Tracer's pulse bomb actually have drop off? It only does damage at a 3 meters range, and a lot of the time it seems like it will always kill someone in that radius. Well, when we tested it, it turns out that it does have drop off, which when you nerf the maximum damage of it, makes that drop off a lot heavier. So now when you throw the pulse bomb, not only is it going to be considerably weaker against tanks, but you're going to have to make sure that you stick it or it's really close, because if you don't, even 200 health targets can survive pulse bomb quite easily now. So this opens up lots of discussion about how you're going to want to stick it and what targets, like Reinhardt, for example. Because I think at the minute, one reason Rein's really weak, especially against Tracer, is because she can shoot him just a little bit and pulse bomb him, and it's an instant kill every single time. Even Winston has a bit of a defense against this because he can pop his Primal Rage a lot of the time to survive it, whereas Reinhardt's just a sit and duck, holding his shield up, hoping for the best. Well, now when you stick that Reinhardt, he's going to be way harder to kill, and it's also a lot less likely that someone close to him will die from that explosion, which makes a much bigger difference than I initially thought.
I'm a little bit worried about this because I think they're trying to balance for where the pro play is at now, rather than allowing the chips to fall with these few different entities that they're messing with on the patch that they're not even playing on yet. So, for example, if you've played a lot of 6v6 elimination, as you guys know, I have definitely, but Brigida's actually in that meta, so I'm able to see and test out what the game feels like when that armor component is really important and frequent in the team fights. And what happens is kind of what I've said and I've been saying all this time, that characters that have spread damage, especially like Soldier, I try a lot, Tracer as well, really struggle already against that armor, and I don't know if this is even required to see her drop in power, and I'm a little bit concerned because now, on top of that, we're talking about Pulse Bomb struggling to get kills on even sometimes squishy targets if you don't stick it perfectly. Now with that armor component as well, there's damage reduction, a lot of ways to dodge Pulse Bomb, and it's going to shoot from being one of the most impactful abilities in the entire game, where sometimes you stick it to somebody and it just, a big group hug comes in and you get 2 or 3, well, oftentimes you're only going to get that 1 kill, so the value overall that you're going to get from Pulse Bomb is going to be significantly decreased. And when you start to compare to other things that are much more impactful, let's say, I don't know, Hanzo's ult, perhaps, or Junkrat's tire, especially, even with it being nerfed and having a slower speed of when it moves, it's still a lot more impactful, does more damage, of course, a little bit easier to get it into place. The meta is going to start to shift that direction. Overall, in general, I alluded to this at the start a little bit, but it's becoming the case where playing dive in an unorganized context now almost feels impossible, to me at least, and I think that's going to proceed down the way, where if you were playing against a good Junkrat or even a good Widowmaker with a Mercy Pocket, I mean, that counters dive at the pro level of play, and if you're even more disorganized in matchmaking, a lot of these other characters that you're used to maybe dominating the entire game in the dive meta are now going to feel really difficult with so many different counters that can stabilize the backline. A big one for me is Lucio as well.
I think Reinhardt might go from a place where Tracer is really good against him to the next season when Brigitte drops and Tracer gets nerfed, I think that dynamic may just swap entirely. And it doesn't matter how long Tracer can stay alive for, even if it's forever. If the ultimate no longer really does anything against the Rhine, and Brigitte is there to crowd control to stop her anytime she gets close. So I think that dynamic is going to completely change next week when the new season starts. I'm assuming the PTR will go out around the same time. Now, if we was to move on to Lucio, I'll talk first on this just because I'm really, really bad with Lucio, particularly his movement. So as a lot of you guys probably know, he did get a slight nerf now so that when you jump off of a wall, your speed isn't quite as fast, but to make up for that, it is way easier for Lucio to stick to walls, to go round a corner at high speed, sticking to walls, and also to leap off and then even back onto the same wall to carry on that momentum. So even for someone like me that's really bad with him, this is like a massive buff to the movement department and just his usability overall. Now, I'm not entirely sure what that means for players that are already really good with him, but I think the biggest part of his buff is actually the boop that I'm sure FREEDO is going to want to talk about.
I'm a huge fan of Lucio in general, but having the boop available whenever and not having any opportunity cost based on your ammo is a really big deal. And in fact, I think it really nudges Lucio towards being more lethal in that brawl and protecting your backline than he ever has been before, because not only do you get that damage, you get a little bit more burst by not having to utilize ammo for it, and like I said, it's hard to really quantify opportunity cost. What that means is there used to be moments of time where maybe you're in a reload, or maybe you don't have ammo, or it's going to screw up your burst or whatever, where using boop would not be available to you, where now you could just use it whenever, and you always have that threat, making it even harder for a lot of the things that are trying to get into your backline to really stabilize. And Lucio has seen a drop in pick rate at the top level of play, but in my opinion, that's more so due to teams wanting to amp up their firepower and play better, if that makes sense. But when teams have brought in Lucio, it's really off-footed the enemy team, and he's still incredibly powerful, but it's more so that teams are going for the Zen Mercy firepower route. However, at the same time, there's a lot of maps that you watch, like Anubis, for example, teams barely even cap first or second sometimes, and they probably would be better using Lucio. So it really depends on your level of play with him, but overall, adding all these things together, especially when you think about Brigitte and or Lucio in the backline, it's kind of flipped the other way for me now, where it used to be the case way back in the day where backlines were utterly defenseless at all times. Now it's going to be the era of the strong backline that is full of opportunity to be able to defend itself.
I think one of my favorite things that Defran has said on his stream, who's one of the best aimers in the entire game, is if he sees Lucio, he just ignores him, just doesn't shoot him, because that's how good Lucio is. And now that is way more accessible for a lot more people, and the boop for defending the back line is just insane. It was already insane, and now it's extra insane. So speaking of that, let's move on to Hanzo. I think as the designated Hanzo main of this channel, I would like to say that I thought he was going to be insanely OP when I was looking at the raw damage numbers when he came out. So his new ability does 960 damage if you hit them all in the head. You take that up to, I believe it's 1210 damage if you also hit a headshot with a normal arrow before you let off that flurry. But when you actually get into a game and you try to use it, and trying to replicate a competitive game is difficult on the PTR, but we managed to do it a few times. And I can tell you now from experience that trying to hit his new ability at a long range is not easy, and also it's very off-putting compared to like scatter arrow or a normal arrow, because you're always used to drawing the bow back and letting it go, and then all of a sudden it turns into this spam fest, and it's kind of difficult to figure out. Like, you're trying to pull the bow back, but because you've held it down, you've kind of shot all the arrows off. So it definitely takes some getting used to, is the first thing you're going to notice. And the same for his leap ability. Actually using it and building it into your muscle memory is a lot more difficult than you would think. Now, I think he's amazing. I always have, and he still is. but I don't think he's much better, and he's definitely not easier than he was before. And my concern going into this patch is going to be, is Hanzo still a throw pick for most people at most ranks? And that's kind of where I'm leaning at the minute. Now, I think the biggest buff to him actually is the speed that his main arrows travel now. I believe they got a 20% increase or so, and that is insane, especially if it's a Tracer or a Genji that's quite close to you, because your arrow almost works as a hit scan now. So someone's close and there's not a lot they can do with their mobility to compensate for you shooting, especially Genji. He can only move so much when he's in the air above you, so now reliably hitting that arrow is way stronger. And as well, I believe that the new arrow, the rapid shot, is also better at Genji than the scatter arrow was. But there's also some downfalls to it as well, which FREEDO I'm sure will tell you.
Yeah, where I kind of land Hanzo overall is that it really is a top level change, similar to how Widow got the buff to her cooldown of hook shot, which really enabled top level Widows. That is what the new Hanzo is like. I was at first a little worried that it's like, well, is it sort of like giving Junkrat two minds? No, it's not like that at all. Junkrat is incredibly easy. Hanzo is still incredibly hard. And most of the time, I start to question myself like, okay, so Hanzo's a lot better, but how much more reliable or better is he than simply picking McCree or Soldier still in that spot? And it's not much better. But if you do get those burst kills where you can confidently win a duel with a Genji jumping you, there's a lot of Hanzos that already could do that, by the way, anyway. But you have a little bit more of the tools to do that. That's why we kind of rated only maybe 15, 20% better than he used to be. And overall, at least when the pros pick Hanzo, it's typically only on the openings of maps where he really can utilize the fact that he runs up walls. So think First of Hanamura, First of Dorado, ways that you can get really cheeky angles by utilizing the fact that he can get on high ground. Otherwise, you sort of just question, like, why don't we just run a Soldier up to that same spot? And is that just better most of the time? Or the big problem, the purple-skinned French lady in the room, is that Widow is still insane. Like, she has way more mobility than even Hanzo does, and then a insta-kill hit scan threat. So she ultimately is going to be on top for me over there, even though Hanzo has these tools to kind of battle her. That combo of her and Mercy is better than Hanzo and Mercy, which puts the overall power of them versus each other favoring the Widow, because she can actually quickscope with the damage amp on her. Now, on to my favorite character in the whole game right now, Junkrat. You might have been hoping that these nerfs were significant, and where I come down on them is it's not going to affect the Junkrat player much at all, but it will perhaps make him a bit more fair to play against. What I mean by that is his projectile size went down and the speed of the tire got slowed down a bit, which means that when you're playing against him, there'll be less of the I thought I dodged that nade, but it didn't count sort of situations. But overall, most of the time, the nades are still pretty big. I felt like I could hit them quite reliably when I aimed them properly. So Junkrat is still one of the best characters in the game for me, and he's sort of at the centerpiece of this odd conversation of what is the strongest thing in the meta. I actually do think it's Junkrat and Widowmaker with a Mercy pocket overall, but when you see the pros play, you start to think that, well, Genji Tracer gets played a lot more, but it's mostly because of how the maps work. If you are looking to actually just worry about what wins team fights the most, what kills the best, the bunker style of play still wrecks any mobility style at the pro level play, but you can outposition and utilize the map a lot better if you do have mobility, which is this weird balancing act that you have to figure out. And it's easy to misread the pro level of play because, of course, they're playing in that perfectly organized context where you can get your mobility to dodge, halt, hook. But again, in matchmaking, people struggle to get past choke points, you know? And you're still going to have the problem of Junkrat spamming down and having those nades that bounce and have permanence that really take up space. And if I were to nerf anything about Junkrat, I would prefer them to look towards that, because I think that's where people struggle the most against him, because he always can just lay down fire and it remains even if he misses. I think that's a bit more of an issue for me than these other things that they're dealing with. But overall, as we've said in previous meta discussions, when you have all this CC, when you've got armor, Junkrat is going to look even better, I think, in the next meta.
Moving on to Genji. I mean, this is going to be a quick one. Genji is basically exactly the same as he was before. The hitbox for his deflect has been nerfed, but I don't even know if it was really a big issue in the first place. The devs have explained before that if that wasn't the case, then he wouldn't be able to deflect much. So if the case now is that you can't shoot around his deflect and it still does protect him, there's a few situations where he won't deflect as much damage as he would have, but that doesn't affect his survivability in any way, really. And I think in 99% of situations, it's going to make no difference to Genji whatsoever.
I think where you will feel it, though, is in certain small interactions where you are fighting the Genji. So what I mean by that is, especially when I think about my favorite character, Junkrat, with his nade being smaller and reflect being smaller, I hit the reflect hitbox less often, if that makes sense. Or I've had cases where, like, I'm Orisa and I'm behind the Genji. I think on the PTR version with the smaller hitbox, it was easier to find those angles where I could sneak around the hitbox. So that's something that you're going to think about when you're playing Genji and also playing against him. It used to be the case where reflect was so massive where it took up a gigantic invisible portion of the screen that you might as well not even try to shoot around him. I think you now can get more angles where you can sneak past it, which is going to be important. And yet another aspect of dive in general kind of going downhill in this next patch. But I would say more so the bigger things that he and the other diving characters need to worry about is all the other things that are really strong in the meta in general.
Including the last thing that we'll talk about, which is Shield Bash. Bridget's cone angle has now been reduced from 90 to 60. So what this does is, according to the devs actually, two things. One is to make Bridget feel a little bit fairer against, Brigitte, before anyone corrects me, is to make her feel better to play against, so she's not just stunning you everywhere, but also from her point of view is that she actually stuns the person that she's aiming for, because there's been a lot of cases where you're trying to stun someone and just off to the side somewhere someone walks in the angle and you hit them instead. So I don't think that this makes her much weaker at all, actually, but I do think what FREEDO says is it is just more CC coming into the game, which is a lot easier to run in the matchmaking context in our ranked games than it is the pro play. The pro play, they'll play around it in a lot of contexts, but having all this CC, Junkrat's still amazing. He also counters Bridget and Tracer, which we mentioned before. Tracer's no longer as strong against Reinhardt, so I think it brings different heroes into the meta more, having Bridget in the game, and this CC is just really, really strong in a lot of disorganized contexts.
The only spot where I would kind of worry if you're a Brigitte player is that against a character like Genji, when he pulls out his blade and he's moving really fast, especially with ping, I feel it can be hard to hit that shield bash, harder than you think. It is quite good against him if you are able to land it, so that's just one example of an interaction, but generally speaking, I think you're going to feel it quite intuitive to land the shield bash anyway, so it's not going to be a very significant nerf in making her less playable. Patch after patch after patch, since the dive meta was king, it seems like we've whittled that down over time, and I think we're finally entering a resting point where it's even going to affect the pro meta more than it already has, and as we've said in this video already, I think it has significantly impacted the matchmaking meta for quite some time now and is just further moving down that direction. Any last comments?
That's everything. I think it's going to be good. I think it's going to be interesting, if nothing else, in the next season. Now we just need a team queue.
All right, everybody, my fellow Junkrat and Hanzo mains, if you enjoyed this meta discussion, please leave it a like. It really does help us out and lets us know that you're enjoying the content. And if you haven't already, please subscribe because we upload each and every day. So you're going to want to hit the bell icon so that you get notified when our videos go live. Linked in the description is our Twitter. We tweet out news, updates, and dank memes. That's been it for me. It's been FREEDO and Weagle for Your Overwatch. I'll see you guys next time.